Well, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening to everybody who's on the call. So right now, I can't really see how many people there are or where you're coming from. So I think I know at least one of you who's on the call based on some comments I've being sent my way. So welcome to I guess the first session on the Saturday morning of Microsoft May, which is up and running quickly with Windows Autopilot. My name's Mark O'Shea. I'm a Microsoft MVP for Windows and devices. And I've been working with, I guess, Windows technologies for more decades than I would like to admit. But when it comes to Autopilot and related technologies such as Microsoft Intune, so I guess going back to with Intune, probably started working with that back in 2011. And as we go through today's content, I'll make sure that you understand the relationship between the different technologies that are really required to give a good autopilot experience. So it's not just the autopilot service, it's just a small part of the overall solution, but obviously it's a very important part. Now, the majority of the time in today's session is going to be demonstration based. So I'll do the initial PC setup demonstration so that you can start seeing what the initial user experience is like when a new machine is being set up. So this is like a VM that I've done a reset on. So everything has been wiped apart from the operating system. So it will have to go through and reconfigure everything as if it's a brand new device being deployed for the first time. Then once we sort of have a quick look at some of the things that happened during that initial deployment stage, we'll switch over and there's a QR code I need to pull up on screen as the intermission, which is where that's how you will enter the prize draw for the first week of this event. And then we might even have some time for Q&A during that time period. So just to give everyone a little bit of a chance to make sure that they can answer, ask questions, take photos, etc. Then we'll move on to the second part of the demonstration, which is what's going on in the back end. So what are the things we need to configure over in the endpoint management console to make sure that devices are behaving the way that they are, and what were the things that I did in particular to start getting that experience that we just saw. And then towards the end, we'll go back to Q&A. Now, I can see that there's already some comments coming through. So we've already got from someone from the east coast of the US coming through. So yeah, you're a long way from us, John, and in a very different time zone. So welcome. So let's jump in just with a quick overview for those of you who aren't familiar with Windows Autopilot. Now, a lot of the time people talk about Windows Autopilot as a deployment technology, but I think it's a bit better if you think of it all up as more of a lifecycle management technology. So it allows us to go through and get new devices very easily into a state that the user can effectively just sign in and start using them within a short time period. So there are a couple of different ways we can get these devices pre-enrolled. Now, we're not going to spend a lot of time on the different pre-enrollment processes, but effectively it's something that either the organization that owns the devices can go through the process of collecting hardware IDs, which is probably not the favored version. Generally, you want to work with the reseller of the device or the OEM of the device to be able to provide that device information for you. Now, in some cases, they might be able to pre-register that into your tenant for you, or alternatively, they might provide you with a CSV that you upload into your tenant yourself. So there's a couple of different options, but the idea is that you don't want to be manually harvesting the IDs. So the scenario that I'll be working through today is more of the traditional autopilot scenario where we're going through and just shipping devices straight out from whoever we're purchasing them through. So whoever our dropship provider is, we're sending them through to those users. So those users are turning the device on and hopefully getting an experience like what I'll show you in here today. Now, I mentioned that it's not just for deployment, though. It's also around that lifecycle management. So we've also got the ability to go through and do things like wipe the device, recycle the device. So if we need to, if they're devices that are getting older and we want to, pass them on to another organization or put them out to auction, we've got the ability to reset them quite easily and also make sure that we can repurpose them if we need to reassign them to somebody inside the organization. Now, the final thing on this slide that I do want to cover is I'll be focused purely on the cloud scenario side. So it's important to note that we do have different levels of integration of Autopilot with on-prem Active Directory, with endpoint manager, config manager capabilities, but I'll just really be focusing on what's that pure cloud scenario that if we're just setting things up via Intune and Azure Active Directory, and then getting the user to turn that device on themselves for the first time without it having gone through the hands of that traditional imaging process. So some important things that normally generate a few questions. What's required to make Autopilot work? Now, at a base level, if you just want to test effectively the simplified out-of-box experience, which is you having a whole bunch of the initial setup screen options suppressed, all that really needs is Windows 10 Pro 1703 or higher. Now, by higher, I kind of mean two things by higher. So it's a higher version of Windows 10 than 1703, but this also applies to things like Windows 10 Education and Windows 10 Enterprise as well. Now, the reality is that while that might be a good way just to test that out-of-box experience, you don't give someone a new PC that just does an Azure Active domain join, for example, and doesn't do any additional configuration and doesn't deploy any applications. So realistically, when we talk about what Autopilot requirements are, we do tend to include Azure Active Directory Premium P1, and in the case of my scenarios, it would always be Microsoft Intune. So this is where we start taking it a bit further and saying, let's automatically enroll the device into the MDM solution so that we can start pushing out the applications and the appropriate policies that we want the users to get. Now, there are a few more things that you need to think about here. So I've provided a link out to a document that provides a lot of information, especially around the different networking requirements. So if you're in a networking environment where you've got where certificate-based authentication might be required for getting a device onto Wi-Fi during initial setup, etc., that's something that's not necessarily the perfect match for this. There are also things such as if your environment has got a lot of outbound access blocked. This is something where there are going to be sites that you'll see on this document that do need to be opened up to allow outbound access. But I'll just be going through, as I mentioned, and focusing on more of the pure cloud, which means that we don't need to worry as much about some of those elements. So let's just switch to the first part of the demonstration, which is just me switching over to where I've got a virtual machine running, and I'll just kick this off. Now, just sort of think that this is a machine that if a user was normally getting it, the process would take a little bit longer than this, but effectively I've already told Autopilot to suppress a series of the different options that a user would get during initial setup. So things such as, is this a work or personal device, has been suppressed. I've suppressed the end user license agreement that Microsoft requires. I've suppressed any kind of OEM license that would normally be accepted. Things like the privacy settings, I've also suppressed. Now, in this one, I've also gone through to another level, and I've also suppressed the region and keyboard requirements. So if I know that everyone who's getting this set of devices from this profile is in one region, then that means that I can just really reduce the number of things a user even has to see. So in most cases, what a user would actually need to see would be if they're connecting via Wi-Fi, they need to connect to their Wi-Fi before they could proceed. Otherwise, obviously, we can't reach out to the internet. But in this case, there's a couple of things you can see. I didn't have to give it any real details about myself so far. Instead, it picks things up from my Azure AD tenant. So it can see my organization name. It picks up some of the customization images and text. So all I have to do to start getting going as a user in this environment is if I just drop my name in. So I probably should do some typos to show that it's not a pre-canned demo, that it's all real, but I'll just type that in. Now it will prompt me for an Azure MFA prompt. So let's just take a look at that. Now, obviously here I'm using Microsoft Authenticator down on my phone. So there we go, that's approved. Now we'll just sit at this screen for a minute or two. There's a few things that we should talk about at this point. So obviously you start to see that Azure Active Directory integration, you're seeing MFA capabilities. Now in a moment, it will start prompting me for my Windows Hello settings. Now, realistically, that would be something where generally most people would be wanting that to be something around biometrics. So maybe it would prompt for fingerprint, or it would prompt for for facial recognition through your camera. But in this case, it's a virtual machine. It doesn't have access to biometric devices. So as it goes through this process, instead what it's going to do is prompt me to provide a PIN. So I want to get to that point. So here we go. So, but if this was a real machine instead of virtual machine, so if it was my Surface device, this would go through and very easily ask me to, do I want to register, for a more convenient sign-in method than password. So you can already see here two things that we've done to sort of start moving users away from using their corporate password all the time. Now, by the time I get to this stage, you can already start to see some minor customizations. So it's already starting to use a customized desktop. It's not using the standard one you're seeing behind me on the desktop of the machine I'm connected to. Instead, you can see it's using one of the other inbox Windows images. So that's just a simple thing I've done as a quick view to see what's changed. Now let's just get Task Manager open. Now this really isn't something an end user would do. Instead, I just want this here so we can get an idea of what's going on behind the scenes. Now also, once we take a look here, there's not really anything too unusual in here. These are the standard Windows apps. There's nothing extra that's in here. And you can see that it's already starting to download based on the Intune policies and profile settings that are being pushed out. So there'll be So here we go. So it's already telling me there are some Intune settings. So let's let this keep going through. And within a short time frame, we should start seeing quite a few changes. So you could already see that I've got Edge. For some reason, I decided that one of the new edges wasn't enough. I'm actually pushing multiple options down just so I can show you like what that means behind the scenes a bit later. So there's some things that I did keep out of that initial enrollment period. So one of the things that we can normally do during that enrollment or during that setup period is, rather than dropping me straight to the desktop like this, we can put the user into the enrollment status page. So what this does is just puts the user in a holding pattern so that they can see the status of how setup is proceeding. Now, sitting on that setup screen really isn't as interesting if we want to see what's going on under the covers. But for most users, it might be a better option to keep them on that status screen if you know that what you're pushing out isn't going to take all that long to get out there. So let's just leave that running, and at various points when we check back in on that VM, we'll get to see some of the different pieces that have been deployed. Which means, so that's part one of the demonstration. So let's jump in and we'll take a look at the slide. So this is the QR code that if you want to enter the prize to go into the week one prize draw, grab your camera, your phone, take a photo, and in the meantime, as you're doing that, if there are any questions that have come through, any comments, etc., I'll just get the moderator to drop them in. Okay, so far it doesn't look like there are any questions. So the first thing that I'll just do then is we'll just do one last quick check-in to see if anything is different. And you'll notice that all of a sudden that Edge beta icon is there. And I was going to say, yeah, we've probably got a bunch more network traffic now as more of the apps do start getting pushed out. So we'll leave that there. Now, the other thing that I'll leave it on in here is just to quickly show you here that you can see that it's also triggered that Office click to run installation. So I'll talk about some of the different options that we have for this as well, but let's just leave this here for now and we'll come back in and check in on that after we take a look at a few of the underlying settings that we need to configure inside of Endpoint Manager. So here we go. We're in Endpoint Manager Admin Center. So this is where I go through and do my Intune configuration settings. So let's just walk through a few of the things. So I guess the most important things for us to start off with here is if we take a look at how we actually go through and do those configuration settings with Autopilot. So if we just jump into Windows and we take a look at the Windows enrollment settings, There's a few different things in here, but let's start off with the deployment profiles. So in my case, what you'll see in here is if we take a look at the properties, I can walk you through some of the things that I've set. Okay, so a question just popped up. So yeah, so we can also combine this with MFA or with conditional access MFA requirements as well. The thing that you need to be careful of though is you don't want to be triggering MFA multiple times during the setup process. One of the configurations I did have previously in one of the demo tenants I've got, that was something that I basically was sort of trying to sort of show that you could actually put it in at various levels. Now let's just take a look at the settings that I've got in here. So effectively in here, actually, that's not going to let me show you everything. So let's create a new one. Now we need to give it a name. Now in this case, it's user driven. That's the scenario we're focusing on. So we're focusing on getting these devices into the hands of end users that they will be using as their device, as opposed to something like self-deploying, which would be more of a shared device or a kiosk type device. Oops. Now, once we choose user-driven, what you'll see here is that we could either do hybrid Azure AD joined or Azure AD joined. So I mentioned that with the hybrid Azure AD joined, that we do have different options for integrating back into an on-prem environment. So we could be talking, about having, standalone endpoint management versus Intune. We could be combining them with co-management. We could just be using hybrid AD join without any kind of config manager or endpoint manager infrastructure on-prem. So we've got quite a few different options as to what we can do there. And that just means that if you do have a requirement for certain group policy settings, etc., that you've been using for years and you're not quite ready to wean yourself away from, we can still use this alongside a lot of your existing technologies. Now, I mentioned that I already went through and hid the software licensing terms. I've hidden the privacy settings because I don't want the users having to, read things when I could go through and agree to it on behalf of the user. But what you'll notice though is the initial option that I mentioned, which was hiding is this a work or personal device? Well, because the device is registered with the Autopilot service, that answers that question for us. So we don't need to say hide that one because that's already been determined that we don't need to show that. And the reason why that one gets done by default and why it's an important one is if you think about scenarios like the one I'm showing where the OEM is shipping the device potentially, or the distributor is shipping it out to the user as opposed to it hitting IT, that means that it's not going to have a Windows 10 enterprise license on it where we can bypass that work or personal. It's going to have Windows 10 Pro. Now I can see that there's a few questions that are popping up in the chat window, so I'll just get to the end of this section and or this screen, and then I'll take a look at the questions. So I've hidden the privacy settings. We've got the ability to hide the option for a user to create a local account. In my case, in the demonstration I'm doing, I'll show you admin so that I'm not getting prompted for admin credentials when I want to show you some of the stuff I want to show. We've got white glove, which is where we can put the machine into let's say we've got a bunch of devices we need to set up at once, and there's a lot of additional apps, etc., that we need to get pre-installed on those before we ship them out to the user. So think of this as something that it's not quite going back to the days of SOE where we'd redeploy an entire OS with everything. Instead, we still use the OEM provided image as the base, and instead we bring it out into into white glove mode. We apply the applications and the settings that we want, and then we can push it back out to the user without having to go through and effectively sign in as that user that the device is going to end up going out to. Now, I mentioned that in my environment, and you saw that as that VM started, that I'd already chosen the language and keyboard. Now, this one does have some dependencies. The OEM needs to have the appropriate language and keyboard settings that you want installed in there. Otherwise, it's going to effectively, still, it's not going to work. It would still prompt the user if those settings weren't already in there from the OEM. Now, the other thing that I've done in my tenant, and you'll see this, is I've gone through and I've basically put in a company name. Oops, if I can type. And then basically dash, and then I use that rand, and I change the X to a 3, and I get rid of that space. So effectively now any machine that gets deployed that I've assigned this template to or this profile to will pick up those settings. So pretty easy process, but just sort of make sure that you do have you have to work within that 15 character restriction. So a larger organization having only three numbers may not be appropriate. You may need to bump that up to 4, for example, and in some cases go to a shorter version of the company name or maybe the department, for example. So in terms of what we're actually doing with the autopilot piece itself. So if someone says strictly speaking, what is autopilot doing? It's applying these settings to devices that we're assigning it to. So it needs to know about those devices, which I think is one of those, which is Dave's question that I can see that pops up there. So before we get out of this, just show that we can go through, we can apply it to selected groups. We don't necessarily want to apply the same profile to all devices. There are going to be different behaviors that we want based on, different people's offices or different bandwidth issues that they may have. So let's jump back out of that. We'll go back to Windows Enrollment so we can start talking about the device piece. So this will help to address the questions you've got there, Dave. So in this case, you can see that I've got some virtual machines. You can see some other machines have actually got model names reporting in. So these are the machines that I've gone through. I've assigned a profile to. So you can see that it's telling me that there's a profile. But if we do need to, import, then effectively we need to have the appropriate CSV. So generally speaking, you don't want to be harvesting all of the information for those CSV files yourself. You want the OEM or your distributor or your reseller either uploading them for you or providing them to you. So it's just a CSV file, but it needs to have some different details based on whether it's the partner doing the upload. They can actually get away with a more simplified approach versus what a customer can do because of some of the abilities they get through the partner center versus what we can get through here. So we can have multiple profiles. So effectively, we need to create the profiles, and then as we're uploading the devices, we assign a profile to the device, or alternatively, what you can see is we can assign groups. We can put group tags on, so we can then start targeting based on those group tags. So hopefully that one helps you out there, Dave. But the other option that we can talk about quickly, so there are several options. If we go back to what was the thing I was going to show you? If we go back to deployment profiles, the other option that we've got is if you've already got devices that are enrolled with Intune, we've just got this option in here, which is a nice, easy setting. So if I think actually it's not that one, it's the one above it. Let's just go back up to here. So this one here, convert all targeted devices to autopilot. So effectively, I can set up, I can do some targeting to say that any devices you're finding that don't already have an autopilot policy applied, but they're enrolled with Intune, I want you to apply that policy to them. So that way, we can sort of think about it as a way that I can go through, and once we get into the next section, you'll see where this starts to make a bit more sense. So assume that we've got a whole bunch of PCs that are enrolled, and then over time, we need to think about that lifecycle management piece. So we might want to do remote wipes, we want to do resets, but we want to make sure that the user has a good experience that next time they sign back into the PC, or when they go through that initial PC setup process again. So if we jump back, for one final thing before we take a look at some of those remote actions, I did mention the enrollment status page a little bit earlier. So this is where I've got a default status page, but I don't have it assigned to all groups in this case. But effectively what this is doing in here is I've got it showing so in this case, you can see that I've got a policy, but I'm not actually showing the app and profile configuration progress. But if I turn that on, this means that we can start just putting that person in a holding pattern. They can see the progress rather than what I did, which was just jump straight into the screen. Now, I won't go through all the options here, but effectively you can see that basically things like blocking device use until all of the required apps are installed, block device use until all apps and profiles are installed. So we've got a few different levels of how quickly do we want the user to get into the device. So if someone just wants users to get in straight away, even though everything may not be ready, you may just give them the ability to say no problem, click next, and we continue. But for organizations that want to make sure that the security software is installed, AV updates, etc., are pulled down, then they may want to hold off for a little bit longer. Okay, so I think yep, Craig sure can. So thank you. Yep, there you go. So Liam's question around, will there ever be an option to do direct naming? I haven't seen anything around that yet, so it could be something that's on the roadmap, but I just haven't seen anything directly about that. I guess it's one of those things where direct naming isn't necessarily something that Microsoft has the same view of direct naming as customers have, whereas a lot of customers still want to be able to readily identify a name based on the department and maybe the username, for example. Now, I'm sure you could probably go through and probably do some things, pushing out PowerShell scripts to the device through Intune to do some of those things, but I don't really know if it's anything that's up there high on the list of things that that's a focus area for the Autopilot team. But you never know, they can roll out certain things pretty quickly when needed. Okay, so let's get rid of that one. We'll get that off screen. And before we jump back in and talk about some more things in the portal, let's take another look at the client to see what's happening over there. Oh, look, why have one edge when you can have multiple? That's not really something you'd normally do. That's just something I've been doing for testing to see how it coped. But a few things that you can already see in here is you can already see that Office has been deployed along with a bunch of Microsoft Store apps. So you'll also notice that in this example, I've deliberately installed everything with Office that you probably shouldn't necessarily install with Office. So normally I wouldn't be co-loading Project and Visio, but in this case I've loaded Project and Visio, and I also didn't do my normal trick of unchecking OneNote, Publisher, and Access and Skype for Business, for example. So I just wanted to make sure that basically this was going to be as big an installation as possible. Now let's just jump out to, we'll just jump out to PowerShell so we can take a look at something in here. Now that didn't take all that long for it to do all of that. So let's take a look at if there was any cheating going on behind the scenes. So what I'm just doing here is showing you, so hopefully we can actually see, what do we want? We want from LAN peers is the search term that we want to go through in here. So you can get an idea of the reason why this was able to go through and do this pretty quickly without actually knocking me off my internet connection or causing so much congestion, because I was trying not to hold it back too much. So let's just search through. So in this case, you can see that there's certain files will have already benefited. So you can see here that the file size was looks like it was that 3.5 gig. Am I getting that right? Okay, so basically you can see that it's been able to go through and pull almost like, it looks like roughly approximately 2/3 of what looks like quite a large file was pulled from the local network, as opposed to going out So let's just keep searching for that term. And what you should find is that a lot of what's happening here, even though I'm doing a cloud-based deployment, because it's on a network where there are other Windows 10 PCs with the same software installed, effectively it's able to go through and pull down a lot of that content. So let's just pull this across to the side. So we've got activity. We've got activity. So it looks like all up, we've actually been able to pull down, quite a bit here. So we can sort of check a little bit later to see just how much, but it looks like some things, not everything it was able to find on the others, but in some cases, it looks like it brought down significant amount of data from the network peers. So that basically means that even if we're deploying multiple machines at once, we're not necessarily going to, take 10 times however long it is to deploy those things if it's 10 PCs. Effectively, the machines will be able to reach out to each other and share the updates that they're pulling down so that basically there'll be a lot of internal network traffic, but we're definitely reducing that external network traffic. Now we'll keep going and we'll jump back into the demonstration. So I've got a few more things that I want to show you before we switch over to some of the, so Liam, the term that, I don't know if it's the term that you want to use, but it's treat your PCs like cattle, not like pets. That I don't think that's an official term in any documentation anywhere, but that's effectively the approach. So let's get back to the portal and we can take a look in there. Now, what should we look at next? Okay, so we've looked at the actual enrollment side. We've looked at if we do want to put in an enrollment status page, uploading devices. For that devices section, that's also where we can start removing devices. So if you are removing devices from Autopilot and from your organization, make sure you pull them out of Autopilot. Otherwise, the next person who sets it up with Win 10 Pro or higher, who's got an internet connection, their device is going to be recognized by your tenant and ask that user for their sign-in details to your tenant. Now, that doesn't really hurt you. It's just a big annoyance for that user. So yeah, Andrew, good question. Let's just switch back to that one. So depending on which one, how far through. So there you go. Now, the one that will do that is if you just do Edge Beta or Edge Dev, that won't replace the Edge icon. Effectively, you do have to go for the, I guess it's not really the GA, whatever the term for the current version of Edge is. But that's one of the things we'll take a look at in just a second. Now, there are also some options to stop it from deploying the desktop icons, which you don't necessarily want. But I've just got for me, it's better to keep them there because it's just a good indicator that things are working the way that I want them to work. Okay, so let's just get out of there. We'll get into the get back into the dashboard. So let's just start taking a look at some of the app policies to begin with. So with the application policies, what we have in here is, let's just focus on Windows apps that I've got deployed. So in this case, I've pushed down quite a few things from the store. So if we do some filtering, just so you can get an idea, I'll only choose assigned apps because I've got a few things that I haven't assigned, some older things that I need to remove. Now you can see, actually, can we filter? I was hoping we could filter on some other things, but not yet. So you can see that I've got quite a few company or Microsoft Store for Business apps. So let's just sort by, is it going to sort by that column? No, it's not. Okay. So I'm pushing out the company portal, aka the Intune portal app. I'm pushing out the mobile versions of the Office apps for no good reason at all, just because I can. But you'll also notice that I'm pushing out multiple versions of Edge in this case. I've got a couple of different options for pushing out Office. For machines that I actually use, I push out Office 365 Pro Plus Insider build of the Insider Fast, which means it's a pretty aggressive schedule. But for just normal machines like that VM I was signing into, I don't push that version out because it's not optimized for delivery optimization. So I push out a version, which is, in this case, this is just going to be monthly channel, monthly targeted. So it still gets frequent updates, but it will benefit from delivery optimization. So you can see what I mentioned before, that I did, generally you are not going to select everything here. At a minimum, hopefully you're at a point where you've already gotten rid of Skype for Business from that list, and you can just rely on using Teams, for example. So, so in this case, I've got that applied out to one set of devices, another set of devices, and I'm just using Azure AD dynamic groups, dynamic device groups, to target who these go to. And effectively, this one that's going out to demo VMs, the targeting query that I've written is just basically pointing it to a VM. I was saying if machine type equals VM, so it really can be that easy to do some of that customized setting. Now there should be a couple of other things. Hopefully I've got a few more options in here. Now let me just check. Do I have any? Oh, okay. It looks like I thought I had MSI and some X's in here, but for some, actually, maybe I don't have those assigned right now. Let me just get rid of that filter. Actually, if we do it unassigned apps, that should hopefully show us at least one XE and, okay, well, there's an MSI. It doesn't look as though I've got an XE in here though. I think I did have some X's in here when you could push Edge out with it before it got too integrated in here. So let's just take a look at deploying something like Edge, just to sort of help with the question, just to tie into some of the stuff Andrew was asking about. So here to deploy Edge, it's pretty easy. I just jump in and say, I want to deploy Edge. I can put some extra info in if I really want, but I don't need to. Now, do we want stable, beta, or dev? Now, you'll notice that Canary is missing from this. Now, generally, I'll still go through and push Canary out, so I probably should do a custom install to get Canary pushed out. But for people who need different versions, we can do that. So let's just stick to stable. What language? We'll just stick with OS default. That's easy. And then it's the assignment. Now, because this is getting delivered via, this is basically pushing the XE version down, that also means that it benefits from delivery optimization. So there's going to be some potential bandwidth savings inside the organization. Now, I guess the final thing we should show here is those of you who haven't seen this, just a couple of the different options that we've got when it comes to deploying Office through here. Now, if you haven't seen some of the changes in Intune, and these have sort of occurred maybe over the last 6 months or so, one of the big changes that came through was that not only could we just sort of go through what Intune always did, which was give us the option to select and deselect. So let's do this. Let's do it properly this time. Let's get rid of the things that we don't really need people to have. I'll upset someone by unselecting that one, and let's get rid of access. I think that's my normal list. Now, we've got this kind of thing where there's a few different options that we've got, but the idea is these are the main scenarios that target people. The other option though is we can actually just go through and enter the custom XML data in here. So if you've used config, the Office deployment tool, which gives you the sample config XML files for deploying click to run Office, or alternatively, if you started using config.office.com to create those XML files, then that's something that you can just take that XML content, put it straight in here. So that's effectively how I was able to do that targeted inside a fast deployment, just by sort of choosing, basically by changing it from insider, which is what monthly targeted is. I just changed it to inside as fast, and I was good to go. Now I'll just check some of the questions. It looks like there's a few more. Oh, so Krish, good question. So in terms of the things you can deploy, in terms of natively MSI files, as long as it's all wrapped up into a single MSI XEs, the things from the store apps. So I'm just sort of talking about the Windows ones for now, but yeah, so store apps, and you can also see here that we've got that really easy option to go through and deploy Office apps, or the Office, I guess we should say the Microsoft 365 apps for business and or enterprise now, as well as pushing out the XEs and MSIs. But this basically gives you that link of the different things that we can start pushing out. So there's a few different options there. And if you do have something that is kind of special need, has got some special requirements, sometimes you might just need to resort to doing something with PowerShell to basically force it to behave a way that you want. Yeah, no. So Dan, unfortunately, you can't go through and choose Canary. And from what I can see so far, I want to reach out to someone on the Edge team to figure out, can we, because they don't provide a standalone XE or MSI setup for that one. Or the last time I checked, they didn't. So if they provided either of those, then that would be the way that we could then target people that way. But the problem there is that we'd always be deploying an out-of-date version. Whereas whatever we're deploying with the option that we just saw, it's always going to be the current version of that particular build that we're deploying. So a few more things. So in terms of the policies, just let me show you something quickly here, because I think we're getting close to the wrap-up time, but we'll still have lots of time for Q&A. And I think Lorian, who's moderating, will kick us out if he needs to jump onto something else. So let's just take a look at some of the configuration settings. So in this case, with the options I've got in here, I've kind of kept this one fairly simple. Probably the one that will make a little bit of sense in here, because trying to sort of keep things streamlined here, is I've gone through and set up some additional settings for delivery optimization. So I'm using DHCP user scope rather than sort of putting in any kind of hard settings. I've got some slight delays so that it tries to get data from peers versus getting it from the internet. Now, 60 seconds for me with a demonstration environment is an acceptable trade-off. It means that it's still going to pull a bunch down from the internet, but it's still going to get a lot from the network. If I push that time out to 600, for example, it doesn't demo well because it sort of will sit there and spin its wheels while it waits to see if it can get something from the internet, even if there are no peers locally with that. I've also gone through and turned the minimum file size for peer caching down to 1. I'd rather have lots of small things downloaded than having to keep sort of reaching out and getting them. And I've also got, in this case, I don't think I've got them turned on at the moment, so they wouldn't have been contributing. I've also got a couple of connected cache servers sitting in a config manager environment here as well. But I don't think I'm pretty sure those VMs are off, so they shouldn't be contributing to the content. Now, obviously, there are a lot of other profile settings that we can apply, but remember that the settings that we're applying here, they get deployed as part of, it's after it gets auto-enrolled in Intune as part of that sign-in process. So effectively, Autopilot has stepped out of the way, and at that point, it's Intune that's starting to push these settings down. So there's a lot of different Windows 10 settings, things like ADMX templates via So in this tenant, I just realized I haven't done it here. I haven't configured things like OneDrive known folder move setup. So that's something that's a good idea to do with Autopilot. If you've got Surface devices, you can customize the firmware through Intune. So you can see that there's a lot of different options in here. I won't go through them all because I'm guessing there might be a couple of questions that we can probably answer by doing demonstrations. So let's switch over quickly to the questions, and I'll walk through I'm just checking to see which questions I haven't dealt with over here yet. Okay, so I think I can get rid of Krish. I've answered your one. And okay, so yeah, so Dan, yeah, Canary is, I think that's daily builds. Not something yet. So think about some of the things that they're going, do you really want to be using Intune to push Canary builds out and have someone accidentally choose Canary builds because they like the yellow icon, and users are wondering why they're getting constant new builds of Edge every day? So it does deploy Business Office though, Craig. There are two different ways we could do it. So one of the ways is using config.office.com. So this is why I thought we can do some demos as part of the Q&A as well. So if we want to deploy the business version, aka, yep. So let's jump down. Here we go. So all we do is we just create the XML through the Office customization tool to have the business settings in there, and then we can so save the XML. So basically export it, then open the XML file, paste the contents into that that screen that you saw. Now, the other thing you can do though that also works is not deploy business, just deploy Pro Plus, and then on first user sign in, it will actually go through, validate the user license and go, you're not licensed for Pro Plus, you're licensed for business, and it will just do an in-place conversion because it's 99.9% the same bits as you're probably already aware. So that's one of the things that when I used to have to do some different versions before that functionality got rolled in, that was something that I did. The only thing that you'd have to warn people about is if it was someone who went and immediately checked what version, it might set it unlicensed before for a few seconds or a minute or two. You had to basically sign in, or you had to log into Office, close Office, then open an Office app up again, and it would basically automatically be showing up as Pro Plus. Oh, sorry, business, not as Pro Plus. So yeah, so hopefully those answers have given that help you out there, but just be careful here because hopefully now Microsoft starts moving towards the term Microsoft. What's the official name for them now? I've already forgotten. Let me just check over in PowerPoint. Microsoft apps. Yeah, if they just call them Microsoft apps, which is a bit of a generic term, hopefully that kills that terminology where they use Office Pro Plus when they don't really mean Pro Plus. They just mean Office that's part of a subscription in a commercial environment for Windows customers. Yeah, that's a bit of a mouthful if you wanted to say it accurately. Yep, so these devices do actually get Defender ATP. So let me jump out and show you in here. Now the Defender ATP stuff is ridiculously easy. And I might be able to show you a before and after. So effectively now the ATP option, you can see that I've already got it enabled. Effectively, if I went through and disabled this, I just go through and say, enable it again. So yeah, pretty easy process. But what we used to have to do, and this is going back quite a while, we used to have to do some custom OMA URI settings. So let's just take a quick look in the policies because I don't delete some of the old ones just as a bit of a reminder of some of the things that have changed. Yeah, so what you can see here is that now I've still got this old Microsoft Defender ATP custom profile where effectively if we jump in and take a look at that, to say it was kind of ugly to have to do it this way, but it's a way that we can take advantage of what's in the OS that the MDM solutions may not be exposing just yet. I've seen people on the internet talk about it, but I haven't heard people off the internet talk about it, if that's a good way to answer that question, because they'd have to come up with an alternate way of getting those things out to people. No, Autopilot is a Windows technology. So every OS has got its variation of something along these lines. Autopilot is the Windows technology. So the same way that you've got things like, mobile devices especially were kind of the ones that sort of pushed this quite hard, but other platforms also have their variations. So before we finish up, any final questions before I get kicked out? And I guess I'll also move to the next slide, which is to say a big thank you to the sponsors. So, obviously, if there's a prize draw, that means that somebody has been providing prizes. So a huge thank you to the sponsors that you can see up on screen here. No, so it has to be Windows 10 Pro or higher. Windows 10 Pro doesn't know how to do that initial connection out to Azure AD to see if it's an organizationally required or an organizationally registered device. Now the hardware that a Win 10 Pro device is on, can still participate in Autopilot, but you'd have to upgrade the operating system to Windows 10 Pro first. Oh, no. So there was no benefit with that custom profile, Dan, for the Defender ATP. That was just the way we used to have to do it, where you just didn't have that same degree of integration. So now it's basically a checkbox. Do you want to enable integration? Whereas before you had to jump in behind the scenes and set some undercover CSP policies to push those changes out to the device. Yeah, I've just kept it there more for historical purposes, just in case. Yeah, so for questions like this, so when someone goes, oh, it used to be quite painful to figure out some of that stuff. And as some of that stuff has gotten more popular, it's made sense for the Intune team just to expose it natively. Let me see if I can push them over to published. Are you getting any questions over in the published section at all?
Sorry, Mike, I wasn't actually publishing them.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, I wasn't publishing because they were being answered.
Yeah.
So.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah. So I think, yeah, with most of the questions, I'm pretty sure that any of the questions I probably tried to include the wording to sort of help put some context into what I was saying. Hopefully. Now, is there anything else? So I guess if there aren't any more questions, then I'd like to thank everyone for joining, but I'll stay online. If you do have any more questions, I'm more than happy to answer them. Otherwise, reach out to me on Twitter at InTunedIn, or just do a search for Mark O'Shea. And I think it was probably in the bio for the session anyway. So I know a couple of you who are on here do send me messages occasionally, so more than happy to answer them there. So thank you everyone for giving up time on your, I guess for some of you it's still Friday night through to, I guess, Saturday afternoon in some locations now. Oh, sorry, one last thing for David. So for the harvesting, if you're harvesting existing devices, effectively it's a PowerShell script that you need to grab. So if you just do a search for Autopilot PowerShell harvest, you'll probably see names like Michael Niehaus pop up. He's written that script, so make sure that, take a look at that. And effectively, you need to run it at the command line on that machine with Windows 10 running on it. So you can't harvest those devices from machines that aren't running Windows 10. It has to be a Windows 10 machine that you're doing it on. Yep. So yep, this is being recorded. Yep. Yeah. So Dan. So yep. Just seeing Dan's comment. So yeah, just reach out to me on Twitter, and I guess the session registration link you went to hopefully has got my contact details on there for you. Okay. So thank you. Thank you, everyone, and hopefully get a chance to chat to you. I've got another session coming up, I think, in 2 weeks, again on a Saturday morning for me. But otherwise, I think for everyone, it's at least close to the weekend. So enjoy the weekend.